today, don't forget to pack a towel and ready yourself for a bracing dip. We are going swimming. Yeats brings us fish, Emily Dickinson mermaids, Marriott Edgar channel swimming, and Lewis Carroll a pool of tears. We'll be visiting the Ladies' Pond at Hampstead in a poem by Linda Gregerson, and we'll be transported to the east coast of America in John Cheever's short story The Swimmer, brought alive by Marvin Hamlish's haunting score from the film version. But swimming can also bring perils. We'll look back to Stevie Smith's Not Waving But Drowning, accompanied by Judith Bingham's heavenly choral piece The Drowned Lovers. We'll observe ponds and lakes as places where bodies are on display in E.M. Forster's Room with a View and Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty. And our music to swim to today includes pieces by Fanny Mendelssohn, Smetana and Anna Calvi. Our readers today are Shaun Evans.
At the beach, she would not splash in the shallows or leap the rippling waves. Instead, she sat sour-faced on the sand and moaned. The water was too cold. Strange fish. She preferred to flounder on dry land, fretting that the sun might scorch her scaly skin. Did she never feel her fish-tail twitch or itch to dive in deep, slip her fingers into emerald crevices, lick the salt taste from her glistening skin? Did she never long for the soft caress of water like a lover's touch? Or dream of drifting off, freed from the dead weight of being human for a while? Despite lessons at the pool, she never learned to swim. Drowning in self-denial was more her style. "Here we are," called Freddie. "Oh, good," exclaimed Mr. Beebe, mopping his brow. "And there's the pond. I wish it was bigger," he added apologetically. They climbed down a slippery bank of pine needles. There lay the pond, set in its little alp of green. Only a pond, but large enough to contain the human body, and pure enough to reflect the sky. "It's distinctly successful as ponds go," said Mr. Beebe. "No apologies are necessary for the pond." "Mr. Beebe, aren't you bathing?" called Freddie, as he stripped himself. Mr. Beebe thought he was not. "Water's wonderful," cried Freddie, prancing in. "Water's not so bad," said George, reappearing from his plunge and sputtering at the sun. "Water's wonderful, Mr. Beebe, do." Mr. Beebe, who was hot, and who always acquiesced where possible, looked around him. How glorious it was! The world of motor cars and rural deans receded inimitably. Water, sky, evergreens, a wind, these things not even the seasons can touch, and surely they lie beyond the intrusion of man. It was ordinary water, nor was there very much of it, and, as Freddie said, it reminded one of swimming in a salad. The three gentlemen rotated in the pool breast-high, after the fashion of the nymphs in Götterdämmerung. But either because the rains had given a freshness, or because the sun was shedding a most glorious heat, or because two of the gentlemen were young in years and the third young in spirit, for some reason or other a change came over them, and they forgot Italy, and botany, and fate. They began to play. Mr. Beebe and Freddie splashed each other. A little deferentially they splashed George. He was quiet. They feared they'd offended him. Then all the forces of youth burst out. He smiled, flung himself at them, splashed them, ducked them, kicked them, muddied them, and drove them out of the pool. All year the flax dam festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Bluebottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but, best of all, was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jam-potfuls of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in rain. Then, one hot day, when fields were rank with cow dung, In the grass the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I'd not heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. Would you hear a wild tale of adventure, of a hero who tackled the sea, a superman swim in the ocean? Then hark to the tale of Joe Lee. Our channel, our own Straits of Dover, had been swum by an alien lot. Our British-born swimmers had tried it, but that was as far as they got. So great was the outcry in England, darts players neglected their beer, and the Chancellor proclaimed from the woolsack, as Joe Lee were the chap for this here. For in swimming baths all round the country, Joe were noted for daring and strength. Quite often he dived in the deep end, and thought nothing of swimming a length. So they wrote him care of workhouse master. Joe were spending the summer with him, and promised him 2 Christmas puddings if over the channel he'd swim. Joe jumped into breach like an hero. He said, all their fears I'll relieve, and it isn't the puddings I'm after, as I told them last Christmas Eve. Though many have tackled the channel, from Grisnez to Dover, that is, for the honour and glory of England, I'll swim from Dover to Grisnez. As soon as his words were made public, the newspapers gathered around and offered to give him a pension if he lost both his legs and got drowned. He borrowed a tug from the Navy to swim in the shelter of lee. The wireless folk lent him a wavelength, and the waterboard lent him the sea. His wife stropped a mascot around him. The tears to his eyes gently stole. 'Twas some Guinness corks she had collected and stitched to an old camisole. He entered the water at daybreak. A man with a camera stood near. He said, hurry up and get in, lad. You're spoiling me view of the pier. At last he were in. He was swimming with a beautiful overarm stroke, when the men on the tug saw with horror that the rope he were tied to had broke. Then down came a fog, thick as treacle. The tug looked so distant and dim. A voice shouted, help, I'm drowning. Joe listened and found it were him. The tug circled round till they found him. They hauled him aboard like a sack, tied a new tow rope around him, smacked him, then threw him back. 'Twere at sunset, or just a bit later, that he realised all wasn't right, for the tow rope were trailing behind him, and the noose round his waist getting tight. One hasty glance over his shoulder, he saw in a flash what were wrong. The captain had shut off his engine. Joe were towing the tugboat along. On and on through the darkness he paddled, till he knew he were very near in, by the way he kept bumping the bottom and hitting the stones with his chin. Was it Grisnez he'd reached? No, it wasn't. The treacherous tide in its track had carried him halfway to Blackpool, and he had to walk all the way back. A body in the spangled shade of the wood was a swimmer moving through a pool, fractal, finned by leaf and light, the loose plates of lozenge and rhombus wobbling coins of sunlight. When she stopped, the water stopped, and the sun remade her as a tree, banded and freckled and foxed, besieged by symmetries, condemned to those patterns of love and loss. I stare at the wet shapes on the tiles till it fades. When she came and sat next to me after her swim and walked away, back to the trees, she left a dark butterfly. Thou glorious mirror, where the Almighty's form glasses itself in tempests, in all time, calm or convulsed, in breeze or gale or storm, icing the pole or in the torrid clime, dark, heaving, boundless, endless and sublime, the image of eternity, the throne of the invisible. Even from out thy slime the monsters of the deep are made. Each zone obeys thee. Thou goest forth dread, fathomless, alone. And I have loved thee, ocean, and my joy of youthful sports was on my breast to be borne, like thy bubble, onward. From a boy I wantoned with thy breakers. They to me were a delight, and if the freshing sea made them a terror, 'twas a pleasing fear. For I was, as it were, a child of thee, and trusted to thy billows far and near, and laid my hand upon thy mane, as I do here. Out on the jetty, Nick strode ahead again, in his blue speedos, and opened his arms to meet the embrace of the view. The green and silver expanse of the pond, young willows and hawthorns all round it, and the heath behind, glimpsed only as patches of sunlit hillside. Nick was pleased with his own body, and he preened in pardonable ways, stretching and flicking his feet up against his buttocks as he ran on the spot. Across the surface of the water moved the dotted heads of the swimmers. There was something sociable and inquisitive about them. Out in the middle of the pond was the old wooden raft, the site of endless easy contacts, and the floating platform of some of Nick's steadiest fantasies. 6 men were on it now, and soon he would be with them. He turned round and grinned to encourage Wonnie, who was dawdling by the curved downward rail of the ladder and gazing at the distant heads of the swimmers as if wondering how they'd ever got there. It seemed swimming was a rare omission from the list of things he did beautifully. There was a mild and interesting cruelty in bringing him here, so far out of his element. "You've got to jump in," he said. "You'll find it torture going in slowly." He smiled at Wonnie's tight black trunks, the smoothness and delicacy of his pale brown body, and the usual provocation of his penis, now held upright over his balls like a bold exclamation mark. Then he jumped in himself, to show how easy it was, and felt the shock of the cold water just below the thin warmth of the surface. He hung there, kicking back and nodding at Wonnie, who stood stooped like a skier, but with one hand pinching his nose, and then flung himself into the pond.
Today's words and music, inspired by the idea of swimming. Our readers were Rebecca Morell and Shaun Evans, and the producer was Belinda Naylor. You can